We are shaped by these narcissistic relationships, and a lot of the shaping relates to psychological safety, engaging in the responses that will make us safe. And for many of us, that means the warm, flexible, cheery, empathic, compliant, give them a second chance kind of agreeableness that allowed these relationships to sustain for years to our detriment. Let's talk a little bit about extroversion. You know, I'm always loving the introversion conversation, but let's talk about extroversion. Do any of you feel like your narcissistic relationship sort of stole your extroversion? I know I've talked a lot about introversion, and I've also talked about extroversion on this channel, partly because it's interesting. It is. Partly because I've had a graduate student study it, which also forced me to learn about it, made it more interesting to me. And also because I am a solid, proud introvert, and I think introverts get a lot of bad press. But all of that said, introversion, extroversion are kind of floating sort of in the middle, but we tend to veer one way or another. It's a style we have. And like all personality, there's a sort of a strong temperamental piece that gets shaped by the world at large. But can a narcissistic relationship shape this? I would argue a strong yes. You may wonder, where did my extroversion go? So let's break that down, because you're thinking, well, personality doesn't change. What happened to mine? Let's talk about that and keep listening, because I would not argue that the relationship turns you introverted, but rather that it steals your extroversion. So let's break this down. And yes, introverts, this video is still interesting to hear. Just keep listening. So what happens? First of all, my guess is in many cases, your extroversion is what drew the narcissistic person in. You may have been outgoing, friendly, enjoyed big events, gatherings, and people. And those are prime meet the narcissistic people settings. Without you knowing, your extroversion may have been a sort of unexpected risk factor. However, once you get into the narcissistic relationship, it gets tricky. One of the greatest antidotes that you can have in a narcissistic relationship is good social support. But you have to have nerves of steel to keep it once you're in the narcissistic relationship, because not only are these relationships isolating, but once the devaluing stage begins, or even at the end of the love bombing stage, you may have a narcissistic person who is slowly pulling you away from your favored social circle. Maybe they're telling you that the people around you are saying bad things about you, may very well be lying about that, or they might tell you that the people around you don't have your back, or that the people around you aren't good for you, or that they're holding you back, or the narcissist might even say that they're being mean to them. The same way the narcissistic person gaslights you, they will gaslight you about the other people in your life. It may not even be that you believe what they are telling you about the people in your life, but rather that you just don't want to hear it. You don't want to have to keep defending these other people in your life. It's too tense when you are with them together. And you also don't want to have to defend the narcissistic person to the other people in your life. It can be absolutely embarrassing to be out with a narcissistic person. And you may find that you slowly start holding back socially so as to not create more tension and problems. It's not that you don't care about your social circle anymore, but it's almost like the day-to-day of the narcissistic relationship kind of wins. Now, because of the gaslighting, you may start doubting yourself socially. I do believe that over time, most people who are in narcissistic relationships become more socially anxious. It doesn't matter if you're extroverted or introverted, you just become more socially anxious. And it can be an odd mix for a person to be extroverted and socially anxious, because in many ways, you are losing twice. Your extroverted nature means that you want to be with other people, but your newly developed social anxiety means that it becomes more and more difficult to be with other people without wondering if you are saying and doing the wrong thing, because the narcissistic person has sort of infected you with this idea that you sound foolish, or that you are doing and saying the wrong thing with other people. So the very thing that the extroverted person needs is muddied up with this uncomfortable anxiety. You want to be with other people, but now you're starting to doubt yourself socially. Many people who are in narcissistic relationships feel a tremendous sense of shame, and for a long time, this may be due to not understanding what the narcissistic relationship really is about and not fully understanding this personality style. You may feel a sense of shame that the narcissistic person treats you or speaks to you in a way that isn't comfortable, and you're probably aware that other people might notice. You may even have a narcissistic partner or person in your life that is so entitled that it makes other people uncomfortable, or the way they treat people out in the world is terrible. I don't know, restaurant servers, cashiers, flight attendants, anyone, in such a rude or inappropriate way that you feel ashamed to be seen with them. There may even be the shame of wondering if what is happening in the relationship may be your fault. And all of that shame also makes it hard to be with other people. Shame tends to lead most people to hide and hold back from the world. Shame is sort of like guilt made public. People seeing the bad things about your life and potentially judging them. That shame can take someone who would be otherwise sociable and gregarious and slowly shut them down. This doesn't happen overnight, but it's a slow unfolding process. To understand how narcissistic relationships affect extroverted people, it can be helpful to be aware of the qualities that comprise extroversion. And these include things like warmth, gregariousness, assertiveness, a sort of high activity level, excitement seeking, positive emotions. Well, a lot of that stuff all goes out the window when you're in a narcissistic relationship. The warmth and the gregariousness, they don't go away, but your confusion and sadness and despair can tamp those things down. Those qualities in you aren't received empathically in the narcissistic relationship, and you may be isolated from people who enjoy and appreciate your warmth. Your trust gets so diminished in these relationships that the warmth may also fade, because you may find that your warmth is being taken advantage of, and it may get more trimmed down. But I do have to say, these extroversion qualities can be quite protective, because I have met many a warm and gregarious survivor that even on their darkest days in these relationships still managed to bring their warm and friendly personas to therapy, and it can even cover the sadness within. But the disconnect for people who are usually warm and friendly and who are in a narcissistic relationship can be very painful. Your activity level may also fade a bit. You may find that you hold back after being criticized or mocked by the narcissistic person, or that you kept trying to set things up, activities and things to do and whatever, and the narcissistic person would poo-poo it or cancel. It's kind of similar with the excitement-seeking piece, too. In fact, the excitement-seeking may be part of what kind of propelled you into this mess of a relationship in the first place. I mean, narcissistic people are exciting at first blush. Positive emotions also take a major hit in a narcissistic relationship. The anxiety, the worry, the sadness, the self-blame, the anger, all classical parts of narcissistic abuse are not so positive and can often feel disjointed and disconnected from how you usually are. So then there is the question, so did my narcissistic relationship make me more introverted? No. Again, it's a personality style. It doesn't give that much. So you're still extroverted, but all of that warmth and friendliness and activity and getting your energy from and wanting to be with others, well, that's been sapped by the narcissistic relationship, or you've simply been distanced from others. You had to modify yourself to fit the relationship. And what that means is that you have to modify yourself and distance from your true nature. An introverted person has a natural preference for solitude and small groups. An extroverted person, not as much. So finding yourself in more solitude than you want, or being kept away from people, or not participating in the world the way you want, can really take a toll on you psychologically and feel absolutely exhausting. Narcissistic people are naturally controlling, all of them. Now, extroverted folks in relationships with, for example, vulnerable narcissistic people probably experience this the worst, because vulnerable narcissistic folks are so oriented towards social anxiety already and often have contempt for joy and for other people and the joy people have from being with other people. Grandiose narcissistic folks will expect you to socialize in a way that works for the grandiose narcissistic person, and that may or may not include your people. Malignant narcissistic people will isolate and will only let you socialize on their terms. Communal narcissistic people will bring you into their do-gooder or culty spaces, but it's all performative, and you may be experiencing their shaming and shameful behavior and feel disconnected from the people you are around. But their control of the narrative, your social world, all of it, it means that even if there are people around, it may not feel connected or healthy for you. If you grew up with narcissistic parents, but you were naturally extroverted, and extroversion is very inborn, you may have been kept from exploring friendships, extracurricular activities, and other activities that fostered connection. You may have grown up in a home where any socializing was only on your parents' terms. You may have also had your warmth and gregariousness shamed and silenced if it didn't work for your parent or parents. And then it wouldn't be permitted for you, and you'd have to clip that away. When you're raised by narcissistic parents, again, your very nature is stolen and is never, ever allowed to grow. I have watched survivors who are naturally gregarious, extroverted, warm, and connected with others have to become closed off from the world, isolated, and disconnected because they were in long-term relationships with narcissistic people who cut them off from others, and it was terrible to witness. It was like watching someone die on the vine. When I would spend time with them, they would be their warm, naturally ebullient selves. And when I would leave my visits with them, I would always wonder how much richer their lives would be if they weren't in this isolating and cold relationship. For those of you asking or thinking, well, why didn't they just get out if it was so miserable and isolating? First of all, you know better than to even think that question on this channel. And even as I think of the folks that the many folks I know that were and are in this kind of situation, in the cases I can think of, in some cases it was culturally forbidden for them to walk out of the relationship. The fallout would have been too treacherous and damaging. Another was an older person who couldn't leave. The other people were financially dependent. Another person, many of these people were in systems where they never would have been able to get joint custody. It was so clear that their lives would improve almost right away if they were not caught in the confines of that narcissistic relationship, simply because their true extroverted nature could take flight again. It is horrifying to watch people be so pulled from their true nature and not be able to lean into what is their source of energy and joy, which in the case of extroverted people is other people. If you are an extrovert who feels like you've been pulled away from sort of who you are, you're like, where did that extroversion goes? That you've been pulled away from what matters to you, other people, social contacts, all of it. First of all, you are in good company. And your extroversion can be a real protection. You may make the good social moments you do get to have in your life really work well for you and drink them up with joy. You may still maintain a few good friendships, maybe not as many as you would like, but still maintain some despite the control and isolation of the relationship. And this support will be absolutely crucial to your healing. And if you do ever get out of this relationship for whatever reason, that extroverted nature actually is going to help you foster some of the social support that will be protective. It's not your imagination. These relationships do sap you and most tragically pull you away from your naturally gregarious and warm self. And narcissistic people have personalities. We talk about that all the time. So do you, and a lot of you are agreeable. So the question is this: what came first? That you were agreeable or you became agreeable as a byproduct of being in a narcissistic relationship or relationships? And the answer, frankly, is likely a little bit of both. Because there's a few issues in all of this, right? One is this idea that narcissistic people target agreeable people. I don't know if I agree with that. Narcissistic people are attracted to supply. So depending on the narcissistic person, they may have been attracted to you for any number of reasons, not because you're agreeable, maybe because they're physically attracted to you, because you have money, because you had power, because you had status, because you had a job that they thought was cool, that you put up with their BS, that's the agreeable part. Supply can vary depending on the narcissistic person, what they think is good supply. They aren't probably paying attention to what a nice person you are. Whatever their version of what makes for good supply, you had it. And that's how this relationship probably got going. Now, the other complicated issue is that agreeableness as a personality style is not a simple construct. It's not just this armchair idea of being friendly, but it's a personality style, and it's got all these pieces to it, including trust, the capacity for trust, straightforwardness or communicating directly and honestly, altruism, giving to others even more than to yourself, compliance, following rules, modesty, and tender-mindedness, which is like sympathy and empathy. While agreeableness may not necessarily be why narcissistic folks are attracted to you, it's very likely why you can get stuck in one of these relationships. So if you came into the narcissistic relationship as an agreeable person, these various things come together, and your trust, altruism, some of that willingness to follow the rules, definitely your modesty and your tender-mindedness, your empathy and sympathy could get you stuck. This is the stuff that may fuel you making excuses or justifying or trying to understand their point of view, your empathy, trusting in your partner, even as they behave in ways that don't really deserve trust. That part makes sense. Now, interestingly, that part of agreeableness, that straightforwardness, which is communicating clearly and directly, that honestly, early on, could have gotten you into a bit of trouble in the narcissistic relationship. However, is it possible that people in narcissistic relationships, people who are raised by narcissistic parents, that you slowly develop an agreeableness, not just because it's your personality style, but also because it's a safety behavior? In essence, your agreeableness becomes a response to the narcissism and antagonism of the person or the people around you, especially your modesty, your humility, your tender-mindedness, which, like I said, which is empathy and sympathy, the compliance or the following rules, because there really isn't another option. And especially for children who are raised by narcissistic caregivers and parents, being agreeable may be how we are able to not be in the narcissistic person's bad books, to actually be able to connect to them. The agreeableness may actually be a byproduct of the narcissistic relationship rather than a risk factor for getting into it. When you are in a narcissistic relationship, especially with a partner or even a friend or a boss, you sometimes find yourself in the unwitting role of being basically a crisis management person. Your agreeableness is actually what can dissipate the harms of the entitled and abusive behavior that the narcissistic person may spew on the world as well, like screaming at a server in a restaurant or a business colleague or something like that. You, an agreeable person, is in a good position to clean up that mess. And listen, not everyone who is raised by a narcissistic person is agreeable, not by a long shot. Nor is everyone in a narcissistic relationship agreeable. There are people in narcissistic relationships who are antagonistic themselves, and those relationships get very messy quickly. They can be quite noisy and volatile. There are folks in narcissistic relationships that have depressive and highly neurotic personalities, characterized by intense anxiety, sadness, and worry. It is known that personality can be shaped. And in fact, our personality is pretty steadily shaped, probably until our mid-20s. But even after that, in adulthood, personality can be shaped in significant ways by trauma, by long-term, protracted, abusive relationships, which narcissistic relationships are, riddled by betrayal trauma, which can shape your personality. However, any personality shaping is happening on top of an existing seed. And might take the existing personality and exacerbate it or shape it. But this standard trope of agreeable people get stuck in narcissistic relationships or are attractive to narcissistic folks, it may be too simple. Agreeable people get stuck because of the agreeableness. Absolutely, I agree with that 100%. But there are elements of agreeableness, like the straightforwardness, that actually get worn away. The capacity to communicate directly is taken away by the narcissistic relationship. And ultimately, the agreeableness may represent a safety response in these relationships, especially for children who learn to become very amenable and friendly so that they can stay in their parents' good books. Now, many, if not most survivors I meet are very agreeable. They're flexible, warm, kind, empathic, patient, self-effacing, sweet, good people. And together, we are able to see how the agreeableness often painted them into a toxic corner in narcissistic relationships. But the agreeableness also serves them well in other parts of their lives with healthy people. That said, when we thought about how their agreeableness evolved, it allowed them to survive in these relationships. It was somewhat protective because the alternative was often going to be collapse, and that the agreeableness was more complicated than a friendly person getting stuck in a narcissistic relationship. The agreeableness actually kind of kept them still standing under circumstances that many others couldn't keep going. Attachment and the drive for connection shapes a lot of our social responses. And what gets interesting is when people get out of narcissistic relationships. Some people have told me that they have much, much smaller social circles since they got out of their narcissistic relationship and actually really value time alone. And that the agreeableness turned relationships into places that felt like a heavier lift because the tendency and the need they felt to respond with warmth and empathy and help. If a person has been through toxic relationships, that empathy and helping all the time becomes very one-sided and exhausting. And after a narcissistic relationship ends, that agreeableness might transition into a preference for solitude, a sort of unexpected introversion that may in part be because empathy for so long was a one-way street. We are shaped by these narcissistic relationships, and a lot of the shaping relates to psychological safety, engaging in the responses that will make us safe. And for many of us, that means the warm, flexible, cheery, empathic, compliant, give them a second chance kind of agreeableness that allowed these relationships to sustain for years to our detriment. Our agreeableness may get a little pruned once we step away, and especially once we start understanding narcissism. And it's not that it turns into disagreeableness, but rather into more of a wary, vigilant agreeableness, a more restrained agreeableness, maybe a more tired agreeableness. All of that one-way empathy, like I said, didn't do us any favors. Over time, the lesson that does get learned is that discernment means we bring those warmest parts of ourselves to deserving recipients, but it can take a while to get there. Our hardwired fawn response can slow down our development of discernment, but you will learn to tune into your body, slow down, and recognizing those trusting, warm, empathic parts of you to be shared with folks who reciprocate and leave you feeling safe. And all of this takes time. You're going to get there, and there are some days that are harder than others. And I will say this, I am an agreeable person, but in the last many months, because of some things I've had to do related to this book and all that, not so agreeable. Had I remained agreeable, some things wouldn't have gone the way we wanted. I had to sort of get my difficult on. to get things done. And the challenge with that was it was so against my nature that I think a big part of the reason I'm as depleted as I am was I couldn't be agreeable and get done the things I wanted to get done. And I think that's a big awakening for people who've been through narcissistic abuse. A, we recognize our agreeableness was a safety response, but B, we recognize that there's also sort of this fear that comes up that if I am the difficult one, well, A, then I'm the difficult one who wants to be that, but B, that there's a loss of love, there's a loss of regard. But then agreeable people actually kind of get bulldozed over quite regularly. That's what I found. So to get things done, you had to be demanding and pushy, which again was which is sort of out of my repertoire. But when people go off of their behavioral repertoire, they get very, very tired. And so I know that in many ways that the world thinks it wants agreeable people, but many times it's easy to ignore agreeable people. And yet that agreeableness is in many ways why it's hard for us to get anything out of a narcissistic relationship, because we will be ignored. When we make noise, the narcissistic person knows that a great way to control an agreeable person is to tell them that they're being difficult. That will often take the agreeable person and say, oh, I don't want to be difficult. So you stop making demands. And then the narcissistic person doesn't have to do what you're asking them to do. It's all very messy, but I think that part of it is then understanding that idea of true north. In this case, the fights I was taking was worth it for me to get the word out about the book. I had to live with being difficult, and if people wanted to gaslight me, I just filed that away for future use. But it definitely depletes you. So again, agreeableness ain't as simple as it thinks, and it may very well be that some of this agreeableness in us evolved as a place to simply be loved. Did narcissistic abuse make me an introvert or make you an introvert, or is it who you are? So I got this panicked question from someone who said to me, I don't know if I am just scared of people or if I actually prefer being alone. She said that I prefer being alone. I avoid large crowds. I can be in them when I need to. She's not agoraphobic, but she said, I don't like going out. I prefer being home with my pup, with my dog. She said that the isolation of the pandemic was actually not that hard for her. She would feel exhausted after protracted long meetings or in-person days at work. So the person who brought this issue to my attention was a person with a long history of narcissistic relationships. She had a vulnerable narcissistic mother and a father who vacillated between malignant narcissistic behavior and just being absent. She learned to silence herself long ago, and her mother from an early age viewed her daughter as either an inconvenience, a problem to be dealt with, or a person to meet her needs. Her mother was very critical, and her father's menacing rage kept everyone in the family in line. He didn't even need to say anything. He could control everyone in the family by the potential of the harm he could cause. Her eldest brother was the golden child, her younger sister was the invisible child, and the person asking me the question was sort of in a truth-teller scapegoat situation. When she got older, like in her early 20s, she had a nice boyfriend for about 18 months. She thought she had finally found her escape from the family system. She and the boyfriend planned to move far from her family, and he was starting graduate school, and she was planning on finding a job in the new city. He was killed by a drunk driver. She went on after that to a series of mediocre relationships, and she ended up in a long-term relationship with a vulnerable narcissist who had heavy self-righteous vibes, whose love bombing was to empathize with her, interestingly, about the difficulties she's had with her mother. He talked to her at length about her mother. He told her, I get it, it's so hard. But then down the road, he shamed her about her relationship with her mother. He was very controlling about money, even though she made more money than him. He would get more emotion about a dish that wasn't properly washed in the sink than he got about the day she lost her job or the day she had a miscarriage. He criticized her friends, and she was afraid he would say something hurtful or embarrassing in front of them, so she withdrew from a lot of her social supports, and she would welcome the rare time she was able to see them without him. But between work and kids and the miseries of life with this man, the opportunities to have those supports were few and far between. She did have children with her narcissistic spouse. Ultimately, they went through a difficult divorce, and now the kids are older, and one child grew up to be their father's defender and has some vulnerable narcissistic qualities himself. The other child continues to struggle with anxiety. Her career was fine. The distractions and the drama of her spouse and his passive aggression and not having sufficient support with their children meant that her career didn't really flourish, although she's very smart, but it paid the bills and it kept her busy and again, distracted. This woman told me that her primary relationships, her parents, her spouse, her siblings, and their families, were all about doing. So supply in her family meant making sure that the trains ran on time. She was always acting as sort of a functionary or a sort of family butler. It means ensuring everyone is okay. Because if they weren't okay, if everything wasn't working well, the toxic stuff that would be spewed at her would be such a headache. And for years, she believed their one-sided, gaslighted rhetoric. So other people felt exhausting to her, something to have to deal with, a problem to be fixed. Other people for her meant she had to silence herself. And she would always be a little worried about whether the other person was okay. Then on top of that, both her mother and her ex-husband would often get in digs to her about what they'd often tell her was how she was sort of socially awkward. She's actually a really gregarious, warm, funny, very appropriate, kind of really fun person. She wasn't odd, but she had been told that she said things wrong and she did things wrong and that she looked foolish so many times by them, by such loud primary voices in her life, that she started to believe it. When this woman looked back at her life, she said her natural tendency that she could look back and remember was that she did enjoy being around people, but that there was this physical response she would feel when she was around people, that they're going to need something, that other people meant that you cannot relax, that you had to be acutely aware of their needs, that your own needs could not be expressed or met, or at least they were made secondary, that she would say the wrong thing. So she thought, to hell with it. It's easier to be home with her old dog, TV shows that she liked, books that she loved to read. But this whole thing, going back to the point of the videos, it left her confused. She said, am I an introvert? Do I prefer being alone? After all these relationships, she said she didn't know. She remembered all those years ago when she was first on her own, for that brief period of her life when she was with a man she actually loved, that she loved being with people. She laughed. She remembered them having parties. She took classes. She had friends that she saw often. She literally didn't understand, after a lifetime of this narcissistic stuff, who she was or what she preferred anymore. That long story I told you is a long way to get into how we get shaped in ways that can feel permanent by long-term narcissistic relationships. And this is really pronounced when it comes to patterns like sociality, like, interacting with other people, which is different from introversion. Introversion is a preference not to be alone, but usually in smaller social groups, and also comfortable in one's mind. Thinking introverts do spend time in their minds thinking, engaged in intellectual or interiorized pursuits like reading or writing. Those activities are engaging, and doing them for a naturally introverted person in solitude is soothing. Introverts can absolutely successfully socialize, but may find that lots of in-person time with people can be depleting, and may feel that they may need a second to rest after an intense day of meetings or gatherings and the like. But when people have been through narcissistic relationships, the role of other people gets very confusing. For most folks, these relationships, for most folks who have been in narcissistic relationships mean doing and doing and doing and doing and appeasing and holding back and having to be careful and a sort of chronic state of tension, because you never know when you would say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. It's not that you were saying or doing the wrong thing, it's just that you'd say the thing that they're so hypersensitive that they would snap over. Now, over time, you can see how all of this can get generalized to all social interactions. And because most people in narcissistic relationships are either isolated or told that they sound dumb when they are with other people, also part of that isolating dynamic, there is a slow process of no longer really having good social interactions, but instead only having the high stress, depleting, inhibited, can't be yourself, you will never get a need met, but have to meet theirs and accommodate to everything they want world that evolves when you are in significant primary narcissistic relationships. Most often family members, especially those you see regularly, and partners. Over time, to make one of these relationships work, we have to give up on ourselves, abandon our true natures, either that or get into fights every day about everything. If we do keep trying to hold on to our true nature while we are in a narcissistic relationship, the conflict, manipulation, dismissiveness, and mockery would exhaust just about any normal human being. When we relent or give in these relationships, we aren't weak. We just need to get through our days and do the stuff that matters to us. And having to prove whether or not we remembered some random thing they told us 3 months ago isn't worth it. So we just give in. That's how it happens. So the wanting to be alone that I often observe in survivors of narcissistic relationships like this woman may not be introversion as much as it is a physiological response and a psychological response of needing time down from the hypervigilance and monitoring and hyper-alertness to let your sympathetic nervous system rest, to meet your own needs without the pressure of putting other people's needs and preferences first, or being expected to do that, of not being on watch and concerned about being mocked for what you say. So many survivors of narcissistic abuse will tell me that the time alone becomes a necessity and it's cherished. So it leaves them wondering if they became introverted, even though they look back at a history when they once really enjoyed and thrived when they spent time with people. That's probably not what happened for them, though. The challenge when a person is in narcissistic relationships is that alone is the only place to feel aligned, calm, and safe again. In healthy relationships, that sense of safety and being in your own skin can be experienced with other people, not so much when your world is full of narcissistic folks. If that happens long enough, you crave aloneness. And then, if the narcissistic relationships lasted a long enough time, the aloneness may feel like the safest place and leave a person wondering if actually maybe they're an introvert. Personality is stable, and if it changes when we are adults, it's usually a result of either a head injury or some other central nervous system disease, or recovery from trauma or some majorly intensive therapy, which a person usually got into because of a trauma. And in fact, some people argue that post-traumatic growth may actually simply be post-traumatic personality change. The events that change personality in a significant way tend to be seismic. And one could argue that narcissistic abuse, especially protracted, long-term, multi-year narcissistic abuse, is a seismic event. With time and healing, it may be that a person may have some evolution toward wanting more alone time and even valuing it, especially if you do have to still maintain contact with the narcissistic folks. But if your genuine true nature and personality is extroverted, you may slowly actually grow back into your extroversion. You may have a cautious extroversion because you're more discerning now. But that natural desire you may have to want to be with people and enjoy and flourish in those settings may slowly emerge again. So while I don't believe narcissistic abuse would take an extrovert and turn them into an introvert, it can mean that solitude, time alone are necessary to heal, to replete, to rest, to grieve, to meet your needs. And for those of us who are introverts and have a history of narcissistic abuse, it can magnify our nature, our enjoyment of aloneness, and multiply it, as that may be the time we need to feel solid on our feet again, recover, and heal. So yep, narcissistic abuse can break that extrovert in you, but you probably aren't an introvert. And for the introverted folks, it almost becomes natural to crave that aloneness, which is where we always tend to sort of recalibrate anyhow. So let's talk first about what conscientiousness is. Again, it's a personality style that encompasses things like diligence, discipline, attention to detail, ambition, achievement orientation, being deliberate, and thinking before you act as opposed to being spontaneous. These are folks who are responsible, get things done, make the deadline. People who are conscientious are thorough, organized, and self-motivated. At a moderate, healthy level of conscientiousness, these are folks who make great students, great employees. They get things done, and they get them done on time, and you can count on them to get things done. Even if they have to overextend themselves to get it done, they'll get it done. Now, to that point, if conscientiousness gets too high, we can see an almost obsessive work ethic to the detriment of other things in life, like family and social relationships, as well as an over-focus on order and detail to a level that can also feel compulsive. If conscientiousness is very low, we may see impulsivity, disinhibition, and even sensation seeking to a problematic degree, to where a person could get hurt or in trouble. Now, people low in conscientiousness often struggle as students. They struggle in detail-oriented jobs. It doesn't work many times. So could conscientiousness put you at risk for a narcissistic relationship? Now, certainly not probably in the way that agreeableness does, or even how neuroticism does. If anything, conscientious people, I could see how they would initially be attractive to narcissistic folks, because it is a personality trait that is associated with success, which makes sense, right? So the success element and the status element that come with it, I could see how that might draw in a narcissistic person. In a narcissistic relationship, a conscientious person may be really good at keeping the trains running on time, getting things done efficiently, and all of that may make the narcissistic person's life easier. Conscientious people almost make it look easy. They get everything done. But given that narcissism is often associated with impulsivity, you can see how narcissism and conscientiousness might even be sort of two very different styles. People much, much higher in conscientiousness may have an ability to compartmentalize a bit, put their heads down and get things done. And that potentially could give them greater endurance in a narcissistic relationship, merely because they're probably a little more distracted, and the organization and the work almost serves as a defense against the chaos of these relationships. However, conscientious people who are often doers may also get frustrated because of all the logistical stuff and keeping things organized and getting things done. It may still not be enough for a narcissistic family member, a partner, or boss. So even that could result in some confusion or even some distress for a person who is very, very conscientious. Basically, no matter how good you are at keeping it organized, it's not enough. In general, obviously the more impulsive narcissistic people are typically going to be lower in conscientiousness. So they may actually originally do well with a low conscientiousness thrill seeker. But then if that happens, if those two people get together, I'm not sure who's going to be paying the bills. So those two low conscientiousness people coming together could be relationships that burn really bright and exciting and then quickly fritter out because there's no grown-up in the relationship. Now, on the back end, I don't know that a conscientious person would have any more difficulty with healing after one of these relationships ends than any other personality style, may even have a slightly smoother path. It may actually relate to the other personality styles that are co-occurring with the conscientiousness. For example, if there was also slightly higher neuroticism in someone, that would actually be what complicated the healing, but perhaps, the conscientiousness not so much. The end of a relationship does bring disorder and chaos into a situation. So that may be what could be uncomfortable for a conscientious person who may then need to bring order to divorce proceedings and paperwork and finding a new job, things like that. Now, one little wrinkle in this is that there is one subset of narcissistic people who very likely have quite relatively high conscientiousness. And those are the self-righteous narcissists. The ones who tend to be workaholics, detail-obsessed, morally rigid, judgmental, all of that. But they also tend to be quite conscientious, like I said, workaholics. So they may actually initially vibe with a conscientious person. But conscientiousness by itself, people like that, they're not necessarily judgmental or morally rigid or dismissive. That's the narcissism part talking about, which draws that out. So a merely conscientious person who may be attractive to a narcissistic person may actually end up hurt by the coldness and dismissiveness. I have seen these pairings play out. The financially obsessive and disciplined and callous narcissistic person is attracted to and ends up in a relationship with a person who is just sort of normally conscientious and has a solid work ethic and shared goals of achievement and organization and order and discipline, but is then confused by how controlling and cruelly controlling that narcissistic person is about the finances, and may blame themselves for being questioning when they should be happy that someone else is managing the money. Note to the wise out there, don't let anyone ever sort of know where all the money is without you knowing it too. Now, conscientiousness is a good thing at that healthy level. I don't know that it's a risk factor for narcissistic relationships. If anything, it may provide some defense. However, it could make someone attractive to a narcissistic person or leave a person who is conscientious trying to put their head down and conscientiously trying to work the relationship out through diligence. And that's not going to work. Discipline may work when it comes to a work deadline or getting a project done. It's never going to work in a narcissistic relationship. My conscientious students were my favorites when I was a professor because they would get stuff done on time and come to class prepared. You just need to have that conscientiousness at that healthy level so it doesn't become obsessive. And remember that low conscientiousness is actually something we see in lots of narcissistic folks who may not get things done and lack discipline, but then lean on entitlement to portray why they couldn't get it done. Oh, why should I have to do this, right? So again, for people who are not, for the folks not the narcissistic person, the you, conscientiousness, unlike some of the other stuff like agreeableness and neuroticism, which give us some real insights on the narcissistic relationship, it may just be a part of you, and if anything, it might get someone stuck in that thought loop of like, okay, I need to be able to make this work. I am so organized. I can figure anything out. Why can't I figure this one out? There ain't no amount of conscientiousness that's ever going to let that happen.